Whoa, okay, internet went out, but we're back now. Let me repost this link, because that's a bit jank that just happened. Um, Still, though, we'll see. It's a bit of a bummer to see that Kershaw's kind of underperforming a little bit. Or not underperforming, overperforming, I guess would be the way to say it, because his predictive stats are all kind of basically saying, my man, you should actually be doing worse. So hopefully he doesn't fall off. I mean, he's still Clayton Kershaw, so he's still going to be, like, incredibly good, but, what are you going to do? Okay, let me just post this real quick. Internet went out. Had to start a new stream. That sucks. Okay, there we go. Now everybody can watch until my internet goes out again. Um, okay, that's enough baseball stuff. Do I expect this top five to really change that much? Eovaldi might drop. Gossman's definitely going to drop, I hate to say, just because, I don't know. That one time I saw him, he did get rocked, so, what are you going to do? We'll see. Garrett Cole, he's going to be excellent. He's Garrett Cole, although he did give up his first home run recently, which is very funny. Um, I expect Castillo to maybe do a bit better, but other than that, we'll see. We'll see, everybody. What are you going to do? Okay, what are we switching to now? There was one thing that I wanted to talk about in the reading that Dan and I did for the show, in the Council Communist Reader. Okay, where is this? Let me find it. Okay, so this is just one paragraph I wanted to talk about before we get into the Agroindustrial Society and its future stuff. Basically, there was one thing that we didn't go over that I forgot about, and I was like, oh fuck, this is like the one main thing that I really want to talk about. And it's basically all about Paul Maddock in his essay, Karl Kautsky from Marx to Hitler, which is very good, and everybody should go read it. Also just very funny, because like, I don't know, my man's got good names for his essays. I don't know, it's just good. And all the Kautsky stuff that people are like, whoa, this is the answer, building the mass party. Dan and I have been like that before, and we'll probably be like that again if I'm being honest, but like, I don't know. Always be critical is what I would say. Always be critical, because, nothing's that simple. Even though they don't make it out to be that simple. I don't know. I'm just suspicious of that stuff is all I'm saying. It would be nice if it's worked once. That's all I'm saying. So anyway, basically, I'm just going to read this paragraph, and I'm just going to talk about it for a second, then we'll get into the Agroindustrial Society and its future stuff. Basically, Maddox says that Kautsky wrote in his last book, as he said, to determine, or he wrote his last book, as he said, to determine which position should be taken by socialists and Democrats in case a new war breaks out, despite our opposition to it. Who could have thought that could have possibly happened? However, he continued, wait, despite our opposition to it, what happened with the war credits? However, he continued, there's no direct answer to this question before the war is actually here, and we are all able to see who caused the war and for what purpose it is fought. Okay, so this is what Maddox's going to take issue with here. He advocates that if war breaks out, socialists should try and maintain their unity to bring their organization safely through the war so that they may reap the fruit wherever unpopular political regimes collapse. Okay? In 1914, this unity was lost, and we still suffer from this calamity. But today, things are much clearer than they were then. The opposition between democratic and anti-democratic states is much sharper, and it can be expected that if it comes to a new world war, all socialists will stand on the side of democracy. Really? After the experiences of the last war and the history since then, there is no need to search for the black sheep that causes wars, nor is this a secret any longer why wars are fought. However, to pose such questions is not stupidity as one may believe. Behind this apparent naivete lies the determination to serve capitalism in one form by fighting capitalism in another. It serves to prepare the workers for the coming war in exchange for the right to organize in labor organizations, vote in elections, and assemble in formations which serve both capital and capitalistic labor organizations. It is the old policy of Kautsky, and this is the good stuff, which demands concessions from the bourgeoisie in exchange for millions of dead workers in the coming capitalistic battles. That's fucking brutal. In reality, just as the wars of capitalism, regardless of the political differences of the participating states and the various slogans used, can only be wars for capitalist profits and wars against the working class, so too the war excludes the possibility of choosing between conditional or unconditional participation in the war by the workers. That's a banger. That's all you need to know, honestly. Instead of like bending over backwards to be like, what do I think about Ukraine? What do I think about Russia? What do I need to do about this? He's basically just saying wars can only ever be fought for capitalistic purposes. So, what the fuck are you doing? Rather, he says the war, and even the period preceding the war, will be marked by a general and complete military dictatorship in the fascist and anti-fascist countries alike. The war will wipe out the last distinction between the democratic and anti-democratic nations. And this is another banger. He says, and the workers will serve Hitler as they served the Kaiser. They will serve Roosevelt as they served Wilson. And they will die for Stalin as they died for the Tsar. Very, very excellent. I mean, the last bit about like Stalin, whatever, what are you going to do? But like, yeah, he makes such an excellent point here. And this is what I love about Matic and what I love about all the council communists. They just don't fuck around. There's no bullshit. They're not like out here to be like, well, actually, but the war is bad because it's a quantitative waste of all of the different resources, which we could direct towards the working class. He says, don't support this war. Don't support wars under any fucking circumstance because they're always going to serve capitalists' aims, even if you're trying to be like a sniveling little social democrat and try and, okay, but if we support the war, then maybe we can have like better healthcare. He's like, fuck you, fuck all of you. I'm not going to support any of these goddamn wars until we get a class war. Paul Matic, ladies and gentlemen, he's the man. Anyway, that's enough to talk about Paul Matic. I just wanted to go through that because we didn't get to talk about it on the show because we already went long. And there's just a lot to talk about. But if you haven't read that essay, go goddamn read it, because it's really, really good. Okay, so let me pull this up on my screen here. Let's talk about some agro-industrial society and its future. Part 2. So if you haven't listened or read Part 1 yet, and again, I'm just kind of like arbitrarily splitting this up into like arbitrary parts. There's no real, like, Will, when he was writing this, didn't like have real, he didn't really want this to be split up into parts, but it's a fucking pain in the ass to read all of this out loud and to go through it, so I just arbitrarily split it up when it seemed like good stopping points. But having said that, if you haven't listened to Part 1 or read it, go do it. All the links will, you know where they are. You're a smart person, you can figure it out. Okay, so this bit he really starts to get into talking about the specifics of how the systems operate. I've just started to record Part 3 today. That's going to be out on Wednesday. And there he's really getting to the systems theory aspects of all of this and the way that the different parts kind of get together. But where Part 1 was like, here's how the soil operates, here's how growing things operates. Part 2 is very much like the next level between that and the actual system stuff, how all the systems interact. It's like, here's what one unit of this system could look like. So this is where he starts to get into referencing his the drawings of the like kind of agroecological city unit that is up on the Google Drive that you can go look at. And he also talks a little bit about the kind of layout that he has for an easy to build like family home as well. So let's just get right into it. So he says, I don't know how well you're going to be able to make all of this out, but in the drawings of the agricultural city, in the center, you have a square of circles that represents a housing area loosely based on the Euro block system, able to comfortably house about 1,000 people. So let me just show you what he's talking about here. Let me pull this up real quick. If I do that, what happens? Not much. What about if I do that? Excellent. Okay, so there it is. So this is the drawing of the kind of agricultural little city. And what's important to note about this, before I get into like what all of these different squares represent, is that Will isn't necessarily saying here, this is exactly how you need to this is exactly how you need to build the agricultural like city unit. And in fact, like maybe if you did this, I'm actually not sure if there is a place other than like, as he says in the essay, like Iowa, that's like perfectly flat and with like no natural distinctions anywhere, where, you could have groundwater and stuff like this, where it would actually look like this. What he's saying is that here is like a really hyper condensed version of everything that you would need to have ecological agricultural production. So the first thing in here, I'll basically say this is, I believe every 4 squares on the graph paper, I believe, represents a hectare. So this is big, right, what we're talking about here. So if we zoom in here, what he's talking about, these black lines here, the cross and the square, those are all roads. And this stuff here is like the Euroblock system stuff that he's talking about. So this is the housing. Everything else, these little pinwheely things, all of these things here, these are all fields, greenhouses, workshops, stuff like that. But here in the center of it all is where you would house enough people to kind of like have enough labor for all of this stuff to work and house them comfortably. Like he's not talking about like, everybody has like a little tiny like apartment that you see in Tokyo or whatever. Actually, I can just show. How do I do this? If I zoom out, can I do this? Yeah, so these are the drawings of what like the house that's like really easy to build and would house a bunch of people and give them plenty of space that he says here's what they would look like. So, bedrooms, living room, dining room, kitchens, all that stuff here. I won't go too much into that, but again, go look at this stuff and look at it for yourself because it's really, really interesting. Anyway, we'll get into talking about what more of this stuff is here in a moment. These kind of things right here are like, he calls them pinwheels. These are like for annual vegetable and fruit production, basically. They're beds with little kind of, what would you call them? Like movable greenhouses on them, little hoop houses that run along little steel tracks so that you can move them from bed to bed, which is a really cool idea. And he mentions a guy named Elliot Coleman who writes a lot about that, whose book I got around here somewhere that you can look up if you want to know a bit more about that. But it's important to know kind of why Will did this and why he drew this out like this. It looks, like, whoa, like everything's symmetrical and it's like crazy. Look at this town. Would this actually possibly work? What this is just a way of showing everything that you would need in like agricultural production, save a few things that we'll get to, in the actual realm of literal food production, not of everything that you need to like, all the tools and stuff like that. But it's basically saying that you need to have something like this so that you can then scale it up. If you want to build a town that's like twice as big as this, or if you want to, like duplicate these all over the world, or if you want to like build them to adapt them in a place that has mountains or a river running through it, or all these different things, you can then use this to basically say, okay, well, you would need like some beds up here for, I forget which one of these are like for perennial plants like asparagus and stuff like that, which is to say, plants that come up every year that you plant once and then they just kind of keep going, as opposed to like cabbages that you put in the ground, you harvest them, and then they're just basically gone. You have to do that every year. Perennial plants, they just keep coming back. Asparagus is one of them. If you've never seen how asparagus grows, it's very funny. It looks like how a cartoonist would draw how they think asparagus grows, because it's literally just asparagus sticking up out of the dirt. It's very funny. But, so you have this whole map so that you can then scale it up or scale it down. Maybe not scale it down, but this is like the smallest possible unit so that you can then do systems planning, so that you can then plan out agricultural production using this as your building block. It's fucking awesome. It's really, really fascinating stuff. So if I get rid of that now, hello, Ralph, and I do that, is that what we want? Yes, okay. And then if I get rid of that, and then if I go here, okay, perfect. Eventually, he says, I want to be able to make detailed drawings of the entire framing system of the houses he's talking about here. And from this, we'll give a full account of the actual lumber and construction materials to go along with all of the objects they contain inside. This is so I can get a general idea of the requirements for domestic production and raw material supply for housing. So again, like what Will's doing here is trying to show how you build a food system. And we might just think of a food system as like, okay, well, here's how you ecologically grow all of your agriculture, which is a huge fucking question in and of itself for reasons that we'll get into and that we got into last time I did one of these streams, right? But no, on top of that, like a food system is, if you're really thinking in terms of cybernetics and systems theory and all of this, nerdy stuff, like you actually have to think about, well, you need a lot more to produce food and to get it, in a like good way into, people's like gullets, right? Than just seeds and compost and stuff like that. Like you need tools. Obviously you need places for people to live. You need transportation. You need refrigeration. You need all sorts of ways to cook this stuff. You need ways of basically making sure that food doesn't rot. You need to make sure that people live close enough to these places so that it's easy to get to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So when he's talking about here, where are you going to find enough lumber? Like, why is it important for Will to be talking about describing the framing system of one of these houses that are built on like Euroblock stuff? And if you don't know what Euroblocks are, it's like look up on Google Maps Barcelona. That's basically what it is. You zoom in and you just go, oh, everything's like a grid and everything's a square. It's because you need to be thinking about all of this stuff if you're actually going to put your food system to use. Because again, food system isn't just, producing ecologically or whatever. So I've got some more stuff highlighted here. Whoop, what's all this stuff? Okay, so this is where he starts getting into the systems theory aspects behind actual food production. Last time we did this, we talked about the modeling software that he is considering about making, or basically that he says would be necessary to produce food. And it's basically this way of splitting up the entire world into geographical space subsets that are small enough so that you can then use weather data and all of these different things, all these different biotic and abiotic variables to plan agricultural production, right? Like you need to be able to anchor your entire planning system in space for all of this stuff to make sense. And And so when it comes to planning agriculture, it is again a lot more than just like, okay, well, you sow your beets in March or whatever, and you put your garlic in late October, early November, and your potatoes in spring after last frost. You also need to be thinking, like, this stuff changes year to year and it can change day to day. And so you need to have a really good modeling software of all of this stuff, biotic, abiotic factors, but also the weather, which is what he talks about here. So all of this can be directly derived from weather data, and historical weather data can then be used in a probabilistic model to estimate the probability of specific harvest dates of each crop as the season progresses, accounting for the conditions that the plant has experienced thus far. So again, like, we might think of food production as just being like strawberries take 3 months to grow or whatever. I don't grow strawberries because birds piss me off. Or, potatoes take a couple of months and you just harvest them then. But if you're really trying to plan things and you're really trying to go, okay, when will, I don't know, like this, subsector of London be able to get, a ton of like broad beans or something for consumption, right? Or when will they be able to get enough courgettes to do this? Or when will they be able to get enough potatoes? You need to basically be planning very far in advance, not just with storage, but also with the conditions that the plant is experiencing. And so you need to have a huge amount of data to be able to plan everything far in advance, right? Like, a lot more goes into capitalists giving you access to fucking strawberries 12 months of the year when you live in fucking Norway than you think, right? And if we're trying to do this as a society, we need to be doing this not just, in private hands. We need to be doing this systems wide, and you need a lot of data to do that. And so it's just what he's talking about here. This information can be used to plan out in advance complex staggered harvesting sequences, even between season extension systems and the unprotected main crop for each species. More accurate data can be obtained through direct air temperature measurements in the field, as well as within the greenhouse systems themselves, and with data logging temperature sensors, recording information throughout the growing season. This data can be compared to what the greenhouse heat gain and retention models would predict for the actually experienced weather conditions. To further refine these thermodynamic models, the modeling system has obvious applications for scheduling local food processing operations and food transport between regions, even before food itself is harvested. So yeah, like, if you have all of this information and say you're able to see like, oh damn, there's like a huge heat wave coming, maybe we should actually harvest these, I don't know what some that like wouldn't like heat. Like, maybe we should actually harvest all of this spinach soon because otherwise it's just going to wilt. Or maybe we should harvest, all of these tomatoes or whatever with just slightly before they're ready. All of this stuff is necessary for when you're planning things. So it's a huge amount of data that you have to go through, and you would need to include all of these different weather systems and all of this different stuff in your kind of town subset, like we showed when we were just looking at the map there. So using previous season's yield data and the nutrient content of crops and their residues, the nutrient removal rates can be estimated for each bed in the system. That's also very important. Like, you're going to be needing to know, okay, how much nitrogen has come out of the soil now that I've taken up my leafy greens? How much phosphorus have they taken out of the soil? How much potassium? So that you can then plan out in advance when you're going to need shipments of more fertilizers, right? And all of this data, you'll be able to predict into the future how much compost you'll need, how much manure you'll need, so that those other systems that we think of as like exterior to food production can begin these processes that do take time before you actually need them. So you can predict all of this stuff. You go, okay, the garlic's going to take this much nitrogen out of the soil. I have a bed of like 500 things of garlic. Carry the two. Okay, I'm going to need X pounds of nitrogen-rich fertilizer, right? So all this stuff, very, very cool and very important. Periodically, the beds would need also to have soil tests performed to check macronutrient and micronutrient levels. So yeah, so you're not just predicting and guessing, you're actually comparing this against material data. By solving matrix equations that represent nutrient conditions of various manure, amendment, and compost mixtures, and mixing these together in the central square in the center of the pinwheels, the specific nutrient ratios required for each crop can be applied to the beds. So if we go back to that here, and I do this. Hello, Ralph. What he's talking about here in the center of these pinwheels is basically, these are the pinwheels. So these are 4-hectare beds next to each other for annual fruit and veg production. And in the center of it, you basically have a little area where you can shut the fuck up, where you can have all of your nutrients mixed together, all of your fertilizers specific to each bed. And there's a reason that there isn't just like on this map, all of these beds together. There are actually a number of different reasons why they aren't all together. Part of it has to do with cross-pollination and, different things like that. But also because each bed is going to have specific nutrient requirements. And it's probably better to just kind of sort those all out and have 4 beds together. So it's like a lot, right? This is 4 hectares of beds. But in the center, you have a little quarter hectare where you're able to like mix everything. I think it makes sense. And again, you can see that there's 1, 2, 3, 4 here, 1, 2, 3, 4 there, and there are 4 in each quadrant. 4 times 4 makes 16. So that's 16. No, 16. Well, fucking, you do the math. It's a lot of it's a lot of space for vegetable and fruit production with a population center living in the middle here. So that's good stuff if you ask me. Okay, so how do I get rid of that now? If I do this, and I do this, there we go. Okay. Where were we? I'd also like to be able to work biochar into the subsoils. Poor Proles just did a whole thing about biochar, where they're like, biochar, does it work? Biochar, biochar. During an initial double digging process, double digging, huh? When first forming the beds, so that the drainage through clay layers or through the plow pan can be increased and the biochar can absorb nitrates that leach beyond the crop root zone, allowing longer rooted crops to then periodically bring these back to the surface. So biochar basically then when you dig it into the soil, it acts as a way of holding on to different nutrients that would otherwise just be lost through soil erosion, right? Rain or just different plants sucking them all up, that kind of thing. So you want to keep this stuff in your soil. It's kind of like, what peat does for water, where peat kind of like makes it so that you have really good water retention in your soil for you. So you kind of, even though you shouldn't, sometimes people use peat compost mixes for things like carrots or parsnips because they kind of need to be wet. The roots need to be wet for them to grow properly. If you've ever tried to grow carrots, it's a fucking pain in the ass. But if you cheat and you don't care about the environment, you can use peat composts and you're fucking golden because they'll just stay wet, baby. Once the soil composition has been adjusted, these bed systems are pretty much maintained in the same manner that it sounds like you're using in your no-dig system, which is basically just adding compost and adding stuff that you need on top of it. I mean, the no-dig system is literally just adding compost year in, year out. But here he's kind of talking about being a bit more scientific. So if you didn't know about how complicated some of this stuff is, it can be complicated, but this is like a real variety attenuating situation that he's talking about here by basically getting rid of all of the complexity. Or not even getting rid. Capitalist agriculture gets rid of complexity. This just goes with it, and it harnesses the different kind of things, the complexity, like nutrient loss and things like that, it kind of works around it in a really interesting combination of like centralization of, like working out different data collection things like weather and soil tests and stuff like that, but also with kind of autonomy of different operational units by spreading all of this stuff out. So it's really smart. It really rocks, and it makes all of this stuff like a lot more simple, as opposed to what capitalist agriculture does, which is just spray everything with fucking petrochemicals. So he talks about how there's a circular gap on the inner side of this ring of the 10-acre fields. This is permanent pasture with white clover being periodically reseeded to provide a nectar source for bees and extra pasture space that various kinds of poultry, can be rotated through. Okay, so let's go back to that. Have a look at this. So on the map, if I'm guessing on the 10-acre spaces, 10-acre, if I do my math right. Anyway, he's talking about somewhere on here. I could figure this out. I think it's somewhere along here, if I had to guess, or maybe it's here. There's somewhere on this map, which is what he's talking about, which is like constantly keeping a place for pollinators to kind of just vibe and hang out and do their thing. So let me go back to the essay. And basically, if we have places like that, your poultry can go and hang out. Chickens, they don't just need to eat chicken feed. That you can cut down on your chicken, feed needs by like 40% or something like that if you let them graze through healthy pasture lands, which is what he's talking about here. But the pasture land also kind of attenuates variety by not just being the chicken pasture place, but also by being a place for flowers to grow and things like that. So that bees and local pollinators can come hang out. When was the last time you saw a honeybee? I've seen one so far this season. It's kind of depressing me. I'm seeing a lot more bumblebees, which we like bumblebees, but honeybees, come on. And well, talk about disasters for pollinators. You don't see many native pollinators either. Shame. What are you gonna do? Along this entire inner circle near the annual beds, if you place perimeter strips of trap crops, this is really interesting, like sunflowers and sorghum. Oh, I got all my sunflowers going this year. Here's what you need to know if you're trying to grow sunflowers in the United Kingdom and you're not using slug pellets because you're not an asshole. I'm always trying to grow sunflowers out here, and what I usually do is I get like one of those big like plastic bottles of it's like soda water or something, and you kind of cut them open. And what I do, because slugs always eat my fucking sunflowers, because slugs will just devour sunflower seedlings like no other business. They like them almost more than they like brassicas. Is I kind of cut them in half and then I put them on top of my seedlings so that the sunflower can then grow with protection, and it acts like a little mini greenhouse. But then even once they're like this tall, like that tall, I guess, I take the thing off, and then all the fucking slugs just immediately come and just destroy the sunflower plant, no matter how big it is. What I've done this year, which is much smarter, is I've started just growing them in like actual buckets, and then I'll just transplant them soon. I got some that are like massive at this point. It's very, very cool. Or I'll just keep them here instead of taking them to the allotment, because sunflowers fucking rock. Anyway, trap crops. Let's talk about trap crops. Sunflowers and sorghum combined with insectiary plants like buckwheat, and the same would also be good to do on the outer edge of the 10-acre plots. So what trap crops are, he says, they attract insects like stink bugs to them, and the flowers feed parasitoid wasps in large numbers that will prey on them, forming a large swarm of predatory insects that act as a barrier that any other insects moving through the fields into the intensive bed systems must pass through. The intensive bed systems are those little pinwheely type things. If this is done on the outer edge of the 10-acre plots, two concentric rings are formed that act as lines of defense, protecting the entire system from traveling insect pests. If you've ever tried to grow anything, you know how much of a fucking pain in the ass. Funny that we're talking about this today, actually, because I just got my first goddamn black fly infestation on my goddamn broad beans today. I went and checked on them, and it's like, oh, yep, there they are. Which is kind of a pain in the ass, because I don't really want to pinch the tops yet. Yeah, just because I'd like them to grow a little bit more. What are you going to do? But anyway, he's basically saying if you have a big swarm of like insectoid wasps and all of these other bugs that eat the bugs that kind of prey on the plants that you're trying to grow, this is a real way of kind of like attenuating those goddamn bugs from coming in a natural way, so you don't just have to spray everything. I'd like to know how much this works, because it seems fucking cool if it does work. These also provide the larger scale field crops with an extra level of protection against insect damage. This can be augmented by adding similar diversity strips between fields that can target common insect pests of each crop type. So like specific things that you know, God damn it, black fly is going to be going after this. Okay, plant some things that are going to attract a ton of ladybugs or something like that. The ladybugs, I've bought ladybugs before to go after aphids. They just kind of fuck off. They don't really like staying unless you actually put them in a greenhouse. They'll just fuck off. They'll just fly somewhere else. Ladybugs, though, very cool. Surrounding these, along the outer corners of the entire system, are four groups of 40-acre plots that are dedicated to dairy pastures, incorporating a lay farming system. Okay, so let's show this as well. So what he's talking about here, and I'll zoom out so we can all see again on this big map. Okay, so we got our annual fruit and veg production beds here. You know, those are all those little pinwheels, 4 sets of them here, there, and there. This is where people live. I would imagine this is maybe where the little trap things are going and where you can have your chickens running around. But now we're talking about these things, these big things here. And these are incorporated into a lay farming system. And this is very important because this is why what he's putting forward here is better than permaculture, right? This stuff's really important. Permaculture basically likes to talk about how we need to get past growing grain crops because monocultures, man, are just really bad. And, you know, if they are done poorly, like they are being done now, they're really, really bad. They're really detrimental to everything. But we need to be able to produce grain and cereal crops. Otherwise, like everybody on the planet's going to fucking die, like immediately. So we probably need to keep doing this. So it's a good idea to learn how to do it ecologically. And this whole idea that Will's putting forward here of a lay farming system, which has been around forever, but I've never really learned too much about it other than just like what they were doing in the Middle Ages, right, with their 3-field rotations. It's really, really interesting. So this is stuff we all need to understand, I think. So he says half of these fields are covered with perennial pastures with a mixture of grasses, forbs, and legumes. 2 plots in each quadrant are active pastures with grazing animals. So legumes and the different grasses that he's talking about, specifically like beans, those are putting nitrogen back into the soil. One of the reasons that permaculturist people and just people, ecologists in general, kind of talk about why grain production is so bad. If you go to like Iowa or fucking like I don't know, middle America, and you just see like corn everywhere, or you just see like wheat for as far as you can see. It's because the wheat is just sucking all of the nitrogen out of the ground, and you then have to go back through with some really harmful fertilizers. Harmful in terms of how they're produced because they're like really energy intensive, but also harmful because you continuously having to you have to put more and more onto the fields once you do it each year, and you get to a certain point where you just can't do it anymore, right? But legumes are nitrogen fixing. Things like beans, they fix nitrogen into the soil naturally because they have these little nodules. They're called like rhizospheres or something like that, where bacteria is able to take the shit ton of nitrogen that's in the atmosphere. They're able to fix it into different things like ammonium nitrate or something like that. The plants are actually able to use, and they're able to use, fairly easily. So we like that, and they do it naturally. And beans do this the best. They have the best habitat for these bacteria. They create like a nice little, what's the fucking word? I always forget this word. The relationship when it works for both things. I forget. I don't know. You know what I'm talking about. They create this good little relationship where they both get things out of it, right? Because the bacteria then kind of, feed on, I'd imagine like the sugars or something like that the plant's able to give it. Although maybe that's fungus. I'm not sure. Or they just provide a little habitat, which we like. So anyway, this is a natural way of giving your fields rest and pumping nitrogen back into them naturally without having to use too many fertilizers. So he then gets into talk about, and also like you do this and then you're able to have, once those beans and the grasses have grown quite a bit and they're being rested, you then have animals come in and graze on all of that stuff because they love it. So then that cuts down on feed. It gives a place for all of these animals like cows or pigs or even chickens to a certain extent, but these are huge fucking fields, so probably like cows and pigs. It gives a place for them to graze, and their manure then acts to build the organic substrate of the soil again. So it's just an excellent system. We like this. This is what the peasants did, baby. We should be doing it, but better. So one plot is planted to pasture each year and left to grow for another year to allow time for pasture establishment. One plot has pigs pastured on it. With the McLean, this is so fucking hard for me to say, the McLean County system of swine sanitation to be used for farrowing pigs that was developed in the 1920s. That's greatly reduced the death rate of piglets due to parasites that can build up in the soil. One of the things that happens when you're trying to raise pigs is that they're fucking filthy. And if you leave them, much like any kind of other animal that you're trying to raise on pasture, like if you leave them in the same area for too long, they can either start to eat grasses and stuff like that where they're pooping, which you don't want them to do, especially like sheep and stuff like that. That's why you kind of need to rotate sheep out and give them big pasture lands, which can be really bad because then they just get parasites. Or it just, the parasites, they just love the kind of pig filth, so they'll build up in the soil. And if you're keeping pigs on the same bit of land, or if you're keeping sheep or something like that on the same bit of land, you're going to start to have really high death rates of your animals for no reason at all. Just because you're not looking after your land. So if you're able to do this rotation of like pasture, well, basically like grow pasture, let it sit for a year, let animals come on, eat it up, rotate them out, then use that land to grow stuff, you're solving like a lot of issues. And the McLean County system of swine sanitation was basically a way to kind of get around animals dying, specifically pigs dying from parasites that build up into the soil. And you need to not have pigs grazing on a specific bit of land for like a while, for like a couple of years for these parasites to die off. And that it does this. So this allows for fresh pasture to always be available for farrowing. Farrowing is just raising pigs that hasn't had any pigs on it in the last 20 years. Yeah, 20 years. It's a fucking long time. And since it will be broken up for field crops the following years, the damage pigs cause to the pasture doesn't matter. Pigs, they will damage your land. Don't get pigs. I don't know why you get pigs. You're a sicko, I guess. They're cute for like the first couple of weeks, and then you got to deal with fucking pigs. Pigs actively root and destroy pasture lands, but in this case, it's beneficial and provides manure to the pasture that will help it break down after it gets torn under. So again, they're actually just kind of tilling your land for you before you like till it properly and putting manure in there, which we like. This is then planted into a corn silage, soybean, corn silage, dry pea, oats rotation, followed by 5 years of alfalfa before being planted again to pasture. So you can see it's a very long rotational process, but this gets rid of a ton of the issues. It gets rid of a lot of the artificial inputs that you need for fertilizers for growing crops like, corn, soybeans, dry peas, oats, that kind of thing. It allows for manure to be easily directly applied. It allows for healthy farrowing lands for pigs and cows and stuff like that, chickens, and it decreases death rates. So it's really fucking good. I didn't know anything about this stuff beyond what Dan and I talked about when we read the Perry Anderson book on feudalism. And so then he says here that there's no inherent reason that animals actually need to be used in a system like this. The entire system is fundamentally plant-based, but these fields would still be needed just to provide composted plant matter to the rest of the system. And not much is really lost by feeding these plants to animals and then basically just getting the manure after that. This is like I grow a lot of... you would call it perpetual spinach, but realistically it's just chard that keeps growing. I grow a lot of that because it's just a constant source of green manure. Or not green manure, green waste for your compost, which I also eat it, but also I just grow a fucking ton of it because it's really good for, nitrogen basically for my compost, which is not necessarily the best process, but what are you going to do? I lie to myself and I say I'm going to eat it all, when in reality I know I'm just going to put it all in my compost. I just did that with a bunch of overwinter spinach, which is still good. But by having animals in this system, useful bacteria are maintained that have symbiotic relationships with these species. And the nutrients in these plants are conveniently concentrated, which makes it much easier to hit specific nutrient ratios in the very complex fertilization system being used. The decomposition process is also accelerated, and it would allow for the mass cultivation of dung-loving mushrooms, that's what they used to call me, like button mushrooms or the portobello and cremini mushrooms. As someone who doesn't really like mushrooms, I don't really give a fuck, but, good for them. I like looking at them. They're very cool. That are just variations of the species that require animal manure to grow, or at least are conveniently grown using such substrates. I'm including many types of domesticated animal as possible in this system, mostly for the sake of completeness, so that it can then provide as many ingredients used in traditional cookery as possible. So a lot of this, and Willis talked to me about how a lot of this has to do with kind of his love of cooking and about not just this moral, this is in the first part, but not just this moral, cooking's good. Cooking fucking rocks. Good food is really good food. But it also has to do with certain regional dishes being really important to understanding the food systems of that local region, because oftentimes people were never growing and eating food that were a pain in the ass to grow. So you have what's a good example? The cuisine of southern India is obviously really suited to a tropical climate. So if you were to really study the recipes of a specific region, you could see, okay, well, here's what actually works really well in growing here, et cetera, et cetera. As opposed to if you look at the cuisine of Italy and it's oh, they stole all this shit 200 years ago. Who the fuck knows what we're supposed to grow here? Italians, what are you going to do? It would be at least much more difficult in some ways to accommodate the needs of some annual crops. Then you would need very rich soil to thrive. Then it would also simplify other complex aspects of this system by just eliminating them. So yeah, this is good stuff. Very, very good stuff. Okay, so then this is important. If we go back and we look at our little... Get that out of here. And we look at our little ecological town drawing here, you'll notice that there is not nearly enough space to be growing things like actual wheat, right? Which... if you've ever tried to grow wheat, you'll realize that you dedicate a fucking ton of space to it. And then even if you go through the process of, winnowing everything and getting the seeds and separating the seeds from the chaff and drying it out and then grinding it up and using it as flour, you're only going to get a fucking loaf of bread, a tiny one, for a large space of wheat. So you need a lot of space to grow wheat. And again, this is one of the reasons that people like permaculturists kind of shit all over this stuff, because they say, no, fuck that. We don't want to grow any wheat. That's just going to lead to a disaster that destroys the soil and wastes a bunch of land, which I understand what they're saying, but we actually have to think about it. So what we're going to be talking about now is how you produce all of that stuff, and it's going to be going on in between these different ecological city kind of nodules, right? So if we go back, get rid of that, go back to here. This drying omits row crops like cereal grain, oilseeds, dry pulses, and fiber crops that would be grown in very large fields, anywhere from between 40 acre to and 160 acre quarter sections. So yeah, very, very large. Ideally, these would be located along the periphery of a system like this, but this drawing assumes that in an early stage of development, it would be too difficult to control the uninterrupted expanses of large land enough to directly incorporate these into the rest of the system. So then this is very important. This is how he gets around that in kind of a transitional phase. These instead exist as isolated clusters distributed throughout the local area, operated either by individual families or just like people, I guess, or much smaller communities than exist in the clustered village system that I'm describing here. These row crops are incorporated into a large integrated crop livestock rotation using another ley farming system, similar to the one that I described before, where row crop rotation is periodically interrupted by perennial pasture. So again, that's, row crops like your wheat, and then you give it a rest, you put a bunch of stuff like beans and grasses in there, your animals come along for a couple of years, they eat all that up, you rotate that out, you till it up, and they grow row crops again. These can accommodate any sort of grazing system on them, including dairy, if they contain small-scale cheese-making facilities or are close enough to clustered villages for milk trucks to transfer milk to creameries located there. They would be more suited, however, to wool production, grass-fed meat production, and pastured poultry or pastured pig systems. So I think one of the reasons he's saying there that it would be cool to have dairy on these, but maybe not, is because you would have to have, think about it in terms of variety. If these are just spread out all over the place, you're going to want to have as few of these cheese making facilities as possible and kind of milking facilities, as possible. And if this was as spread out as he's describing as it is here during a transitional phase, you'd need to just have a fucking million of those things, right? And so maybe it would be better to just have grass-fed meat production, have mobile slaughterhouses and stuff like that, or just wool production. That's kind of just how you either sheep or cows for meat or something like that, or just poultry. Although you'd have to have a fucking lot of chickens to cover all this stuff, which I think sounds awesome. Or just pigs, pigs too. I feel like I've been shit talking pigs. Pigs are cool, but they're pigs, so what are you gonna do? Okay, so moving on, there's a fundamental problem that must be solved by any proposal for an alternative system of agriculture: how grain production is going to be accomplished on the large scales that are required to supply a stable and sustainable supply of wheat, rice, corn, oats, barley, rye, beans, peas, lentils, broad beans. I got that one covered, don't worry about me. I got fucking 45 broad bean plants growing. What was I thinking? Chickpeas, etc. Fava beans are a pain in the fucking ass to cook with, too. Again, too many. But what are you going to do? I put them in there. They got the nitrogen in there, fun. Something growing over the winter. Along with that today and for all of human agricultural history constitute the fundamental staple crops, along with high-calorie vegetable root row crops. So, I don't know, fucking things like potatoes or, I don't know, parsnips or some shit. My parsnips came up, actually, recently. I've never had luck with parsnips, but I got the right compost mix going. I think we're going to be okay, ladies and gentlemen. That would provide the vast majority of calories and protein to people in every region of the world. Often the answer given is, and here we go, especially by people influenced in permaculture. Can I get the cue for dun 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 dun? Because these cropping systems must be grown as monocrops to allow them to be mechanically planted and harvested. They must be entirely removed from the human diet or grown exclusively in complex polyculturals that will require planting and harvesting to be done by hand. So again, I get it. I get why permaculture people say this, and they're just like, why can't everything be a food forest? They can't be, because what does everybody eat? Everybody eats fucking bread. Everybody eats lentils. Everybody eats rice. And you got to have monocultures. I hate to say it. You got to do that. But, if you incorporate it into this ley farming system, it's a lot better than what we're doing now. And, a lot less pseudoscientific than permaculture and shit like that. Oftentimes on the left, you get a lot of people just being like, oh, and also we need to talk about sustainable food production. I don't know. I Googled it. Permaculture seems cool. Permaculture is not cool. If any of your friends are getting into permaculture, they're going to be fascist. That's all I'm going to say, 100%. Man, I was talking to somebody the other day, and they wanted to know about my allotment. So I was just telling them, and they were like, oh, yeah, a friend of mine was trying to do calculations, and this friend I think is kind of loaded. And they're like, a friend of mine was trying to do calculations for how much land they'd need to buy to be sustainable. Self-sustaining with their own food production. And this motherfucker has never grown anything. This person doesn't know anything about food production. This motherfucker's probably never even grown a goddamn tulip. And they're already trying to talk about, oh, life is too hard for me. I'm just going to take all of my money and live off the grid. First of all, fuck you, because I want that. But secondly, this self-sustainable bullshit is it's such reactionary crap. People being like, I want to just be self-sustaining with my own food production and live in the middle of nowhere with my own little farm. It's not possible, and you're a fascist for thinking that. Nobody can produce everything that they need to survive, and it's just another way of pretending that you can live off the labor of others while acting like you're some big hotshot that grows your own goddamn salads and potatoes and then pretends like your fucking gasoline for your car or your tools or everything like that doesn't come from the hard work of a bunch of other people. And another thing, you can't goddamn produce everything you need to eat on your own. You could, but it would be really shitty. You'd just be eating a bunch of fucking eggs and I don't know. It's just a bunch of fucking crap. What are you gonna do? Self-sustainable stuff is it's no good. It's fash. I don't know. I hate to say it. So these permaculture people will insist that perennial crops can replace the role annual row. Let me start again. They will insist that perennial crops can replace the role annual row crops or even annual crops in general play in the human diet, and so allow these to be phased out completely or relegated to a small percentage of food consumption. I'm not entirely convinced that imposing a false dichotomy of monoculture versus polyculture or annual versus perennial that can't be clearly defined onto all of human agricultural production and then restricting food production systems so they conform to this arbitrary requirement is the best way of designing a food supply system. And this is important because on the show, Dan and I have shot on monoculture before, but we just weren't educated. So monoculture is a problematic term usually defined as growing one type of crop on an area of land. It could refer to a row of cabbages, as well as an entire landscapes of genetically identical continuous corn operations. I understand why it's used, but the reality is much more nuanced. There are cropping systems where monoculture may be the best option, and I think row crop rotations done in a responsible way are one of those situations. I think the systems of grain cultivation that may include other plants in them. I know that people are growing old rice varieties like Carolina Gold that claim that they're using historical polyculture systems that can provide better quality and yields than be possible otherwise. Okay, great. I don't know anything about that. Don't know what Carolina Gold is. Blah, 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 blah. These sorts of alternative systems should be looked into, and they might have advantages. I don't know enough about them to really say, but I don't think this attitude of monocultures are always bad and polycultures are always better is especially helpful. A cropping system needs to be considered based on its own potential advantages and disadvantages using actual experimental data, and as far as I can tell, we just don't have that data. Yeah, permaculture people definitely don't have that data either. And also, like, this isn't necessarily, if you're using a lay farming system, it's kind of monoculture, but it's kind of not. Because if you're interrupting it to give the fields rest with, like, a mixture of, like, grasses and legumes on the same soil, you know, like, yeah, there are times where it's going to be a monoculture when you're growing your row crops, but, you know, you're breaking it up with other things. So, you know, what are you going to do? Also, permaculture it's a marketing scheme. What are you going to do? It's an MLM. If polyculture systems have been developed that make sense in an area, and they often do make good sense, especially in more tropical areas, and again, tropical farming is something completely different than what's being described here. It's like wildly different. I was looking at, because I like to torture myself it was really cold the other day here, and I was looking at what the average annual weather data is for Honolulu, and it like averages 80 degrees Fahrenheit every single day, and throughout the entire year there is like a fluctuation of like 8 to 10 degrees from the average mean. I was just like, God fucking damn it. But also like the sunlight doesn't really change, obviously, because it's so close to the equator. And I was just wondering, like, yeah, I don't know anything about tropical farming. Can you just plant anything whenever you want? I don't know. I have no idea. It sounds cool. I'd like to know more about that. It's fucking wild. Some people get to live in Hawaii. That's pretty fucking cool. Although apologies for the whole colonization thing. That is a shame. It would be very interesting to see what could be done along those lines and where knowledge has been preserved from those systems of that kind that have been developed in the past. This is, again, kind of why Will's talking about studying different recipes of different cultures, stuff like that, the food. That knowledge is obviously important to preserve and draw from, but it is naive, however, as advocates of permaculture often do, to pretend that food forests can replace all of human agriculture or are in all cases more labor efficient and space efficient than any other system. We also need systems that can operate outside of forested environments. They're not some kind of ideal ecosystem types that all biomes are hoping to attain someday, obviously. Forests exist in environments with enough water and climate that are suitable for trees to grow. We need systems of cropping capable of producing every plant that humans actively cultivate. Our goal shouldn't be to arbitrarily remove plant species from human agriculture. Yeah, I think so. Unless there's a reason to. Unless there's like a plant, like, I don't know, are there people growing like Japanese knotweed on plantations? Then maybe we should get rid of it. But other than that, consider it all in its own individual merits. That being said, there are all kinds of interesting agroforestry operations that take into account, food production in a forested area. This isn't something I know anything about at all, so I'm just going to move on. Orchards, I don't know fucking shit about orchards. Sometime I have an apple tree and I have a crab apple tree. Sometimes they do well, sometimes they don't. I don't know why. I've tried to figure it out. I don't know fucking shit about fruit trees. The crabapple tree actually always does well, but they're crab apples. So, like, I don't know how much fucking crabapple jam can you make. Maybe I'll make crabapple cider this year. No idea how to do that. That'll be fun. But yeah. And then even identifying, like, my apple tree. I got, like, a fruit apple identification book, and I was, like, trying to figure it out the other year when it flowered, and then, again, when the fruit came up, and I was just like, this apple looks the exact same as, like, half of the fucking apples in this book. I'm never going to be able to figure it out. They're delicious apples, though, I will say that. So shout out to my apple tree. Okay, so yeah, and then this gets into a little bit more of the kind of practical elements of food production, stuff like storage and refrigeration. So he says, between the large bed system clusters, there are 4 rectangles at the north, south, east, and west, with roads running through them. This space is left empty for workshops, wash pack facilities, refrigeration and freezing facilities, and food processing buildings. So basically, he's going through here different ways of that different plants will require different refrigeration systems. Some of them, they're fine. They can get wet. They'll be fine. Think like squashes. You can get them wet. Kind of don't even need to refrigerate them. They'll just be fucking fine. But things like salads are much more like, oh, I don't want to be hurt. You don't, please, I need like perfect system. Spinach as well. They need like really in-depth and thought out and specific refrigeration systems to keep them good. Even, like, especially if you're going to be shipping this stuff outside of this little like village community cluster or whatever. So here he just talks about like walk-in systems that you'll need and all sorts of different things. Even gets into like, how high the like doorways and stuff can be and all sorts of stuff. It's really, really good. So obviously all of that stuff needs to be thought about when you're trying to plan agricultural food production or just an economy in general. Obviously he gets into talking about here about how you need a very complicated logistics system. He also talks about how if we were to develop a good system of electric rail, that would solve a lot of our transportation issues, because obviously right now where you just have a bunch of like diesel and gasoline guzzling like, fucking like 16-wheelers humming down the highway delivering your stuff. It's not very energy efficient, and it's obviously bad for the environment, and it's just not very efficient from a logistics perspective. So you would want rail or something like this to just zip different food different places, as well as for like people. Obviously, people need to go places too. And so let's talk about Marx's labor theory of value. That's the good stuff. That's why we're here, right? One of the parts of this logistic system that I'm trying to develop consists of taking Marx's labor theory of value equations that describe the production process and combining them with an algebraic structure, specifically an algebra over a field that represents the flow of raw materials and their transformations as a system of individual batch processes. Data taken from each individual process within the system, the labor time in a shift combined with mass or unit measurements of its corresponding input and output is converted into average local flow rates of a discrete system that accounts for the fact that these processes have a regular duration. From the initial mass of a harvest, it automatically calculates an estimate of the labor time and number of shifts required to send it through the system. So, do I need to read? The outputs of this raw ingredient representation system then become the inputs into the food processing calculation system. So basically, your little matrix for planning food production, once you get your outputs, those go directly into your logistics planning system, so you can plan the labor and materials required to get that where it needs to go. Food preparation processes, whether they be for freezing, canning, or cooking, are then modeled in the same way. This system can even account for how different durations of shifts or number of workers involved in the processes influence the flow rates within the system. So this is basically a way of saying, when he says that he's taking Marx's theory of value equations that describe the production process and like putting them into his ideas for how you can successfully plan agricultural production, think labor time and think variable and constant capital. What fixed capital do you need that goes into a production process? Your circulating capital, all of this different stuff you need to be thinking about when you're planning. Obviously, we won't be treating these things as capital under socialism, but they will basically, or there won't be like a value form or something like that. But you do still need to know, your fixed capital. You need to know your circulating capital in terms of fixed capital, like you would need to know for these inputs, like the buildings, the trucks, all of these things that are required, the processing facilities, refrigeration, how much time each thing needs to be refrigerated for, how much time can it be refrigerated for before it goes bad. Circulating capital, you need to think about energy, basically, right? You need to think about the electricity required to take 50 tons of potatoes from point A to point B on an electric rail system. You need to think about how much electricity is required to have good refrigeration facilities. All of this stuff needs to go into your planning system. This is a generalized modeling system that is just applied linear algebra, and it can work with any batch process, and it can also be adapted to certain continuous processes. Though complex continuous processes would need to be modeled using different equations in a systems dynamic style rather. The same basic algebraic structure is what linear programming is based on, and if you wanted to, the entire calculation system can be fed directly into a linear programming planning system to balance out the proportions of different elements within the system. It can also be fed into a dynamic representation of the sort that Stafford Beer is suggesting and used for modeling, and from those models, simulations can be created. There are other applications of this. It's the basis for all flow network analysis, and Odum, an early ecologist and student of Hutchinson, had done some interesting things along these lines when he was trying to represent complex systems from an energetic perspective. Towards the end of his life, he was making a cybernetic modeling framework that described energy flows. This is so fucking cool. Through ecosystems and economic systems as electronic circuits, though I don't have copies of his books that describe this. I was trying to find his books too. Can't find them. It's a fucking pain in the ass. There are no PDFs anywhere online. If anybody has Odum's works, let us know. Share it with the people. That would be great. So then finally he gets into talking about recipes, right? And why cooking is such an important part of this process. I feel like a lot of like central planning types will be like, cooking, whatever, just have cafeterias and give the people slop. Who gives a fuck? Give them enough so that they can keep working. Armies of labor, baby. But there's much more to it than that, even from a value attenuation, variety attenuation from a planning perspective circumstances, right? So we'll see what I'm talking about here. Each recipe has a unique tag. This is basically talking about creating a list of like all recipes from all versions of traditional cooking all over the planet and categorizing them. So each recipe has a unique tag created by region or book category, book and page number that will eventually be linked to scanned copies of each recipe. Each is associated with a list of all of the ingredients and their ratios converted from imperial units into grams, because that's just better, along with the yield. This is then stored in an indexing system as a vector with ingredients and their quantities as components. In this way, any recipe can be scaled for a specific yield, and it creates a searchable database. Any recipe can be scaled, where a list of available ingredients can be put in, and which a list of available ingredients can be put in, and it will output the set of all recipes that can be made from them. So there are websites that do this now, but this is just like a much more sophisticated version of this for planning purposes. It's basically like, I have eggs, 3 sticks of celery, some smoked paprika, and I don't know, like some tortillas. What can I make? And it'll come up with all possible recipes that you can make. So using this in like a mass planning system would be really, really useful to have all of this data available to you. If you are largely depending on local fresh produce production, this food is highly seasonable, but its production is also cyclical. This allows for each locality to perform meal planning in advance, which is very important. Knowing from each of the previous years what is generally available and kind of generally about when. If there's a glut of one kind of food, this database gives a comprehensive account of what can be produced from that food and what else is required to do this. So again, a planning system like this needs to be planned, or you need to at least have the ability to plan along every point of the production chain. And cooking is just as important, because obviously that's how you get the like raw materials into your gullet, which is what lets you keep working, which is what this is all about. Not free time. This is all about getting you to work. This database is incorporated directly into the entire food processing system, so it can automatically bring in data about the time required for ingredient production and food preparation, and when combined with these measurements taken while cooking, it can estimate a total labor time required. So that's the biggie here. If we're going to be making a planned economy that is based around labor time calculation, it would be a huge boon to planning to be able to say, okay, these dishes cooked for this amount of people has X amount of labor time required in it. And what Will is saying here is that you need all of this information to be able to do this. You need to know how to make every possible recipe. You need to know exactly how many grams of each thing go into it. You need to know when that stuff will be available. You need to know how much of it will be available. You need to know where it's coming from so that you can then plan out all of this stuff. It sounds complicated, but it is relatively simple. It is kind of just inputs and outputs, right? With labor time as your kind of economic unit of account. So it rocks. Okay, and then this is the last bit here. And we get into some kind of spicy stuff, which is awesome. The Marxists want the working class to gain control of the means of production, but they generally don't seem to show much interest in them at all. I don't think most of the Marxists would know what to do with them, even if they did have control of the means of production. Technology appears to them as a great jumbled mass, and they see the great harm it does, and they see its great untapped potential, but its complexity raises an obstacle to their understanding. This kind of broad view of how the capitalist economic system functions that Marxism offers, I think, is very powerful and important, but it's necessarily abstract and meant to give a detailed theory of the fundamental underlying forces at work in our society. That's Marxism in a nutshell. Very abstract, necessarily so that we can understand these big, wheels of history kind of stuff, and, the big abstract dynamics of our culture and of our society and where we're going and how we're getting there and all this different stuff. But you also need to have a very good concrete understanding of specific things, right? You need to understand how people are getting fed, and what does that mean? Well, it means where is this stuff coming from? Where are the tools coming from? Where are the seeds coming from? All of this. And you need to kind of get into the in-depth nitty-gritty instead of just being like, I don't know, eventually we'll figure out how to produce ecologically. We'll all get there. Let's just switch to labor time and it'll sort itself out. It very much won't, and we need to be studying it, and that's kind of like the whole point, right? The ultimate goal of Marxism is establishing an alternative to that system, and I think it provides a well thought out outline of what that alternative would be like that I'm completely on board with. We need a lot more, though, than the theoretical system Marxism offers to actually construct what that world, and organize it in a way that it can provide us for a system that can facilitate the kind of free human development and flourishing that to me is the absolute core of Marxism. Right? That is the core of Marxism. We forget about it a lot. It's not about getting labor time down. It's about everybody just being able to fucking chill and do whatever the fuck we want because we don't have to go to work every fucking day. If we are able to achieve this, we need a well thought out theory of technical systems that describes what they can really do, what their fundamental limits are, and what we know about their inherent structure. For some reason, this is being almost completely ignored by the Marxists. It is also being ignored by everybody else, but it actually matters if the Marxists are ignoring it because we're the only ones with a goddamn clear theory of the social relations that perpetuate the vicious cycle of accumulation that not only might plunge us into a global catastrophic breakdown, ha ha ha, yay, it is currently doing so. They need to stop moping about just because a couple of wrong-headed authoritarian factions of them who managed to gain local power ended up losing it because their leadership wasn't up to the task at hand. And a little editorializing here, fucking everything up for a century. What are you going to do? This stuff rocks. If you haven't read Will's essay, who are you? Who do you think you are? And what the fuck are you doing? Go read it right now. It's so goddamn good. As I said, part 3 will be coming out soon. And for all of you systems theory freaks, you're going to really like that one. It's going to be the last bit. I'm just going to knuckle down like tomorrow or the next day and just get it all goddamn recorded. I live next to a very busy street, so I apologize for all the street noise today and also on the recording. Now, what I can do about that, I have a desktop. I can't really move anything, and I have very thin windows. Anyway, this stuff all rocks, and Will's main point, which is there's two main points. Hey, how are we going to reproduce ourselves? We're getting to a crisis point. We need to seriously start thinking about this as Marxists if we're actually serious about taking power, right? And B, we need to be concerned with a lot more than just the abstract nature of the wheels of society. It's all extremely important, and it's why Marxists are the only ones that have the knowledge of fucking figuring shit out. But we need to be understanding a lot more of the concrete nature of all of these systems and all of these processes. How are we getting the tools? Where is the energy coming from? Where is our food coming from? All of this different stuff. Because concrete detail, it does matter just as much as abstract detail. Dirt Futures says, yay. That's what I'm talking about. Yay, indeed. I'm just hanging out here with my good friend on this side of me, Gerard Winstanley. We're talking about a little Agroindustrial Society and its future, part 2. And so, yeah, that's that. That's the stream. Sorry for little fucking hiccups at the beginning. I got bad internet. I got busy street noise. Maybe I shouldn't be streaming because of all of these different things. But it is what it is. Speaking of street noise. So yeah, like I said, part 3 will be out soon. Again, at some point when I find the time, I will be streaming to talk about that one as well once it's out. Will, if you're listening, what up? How you doing? Hope you're doing okay. The TV's talking back at you right now. Um, and is there anything else I needed to say? Yeah, I'll get to it when I get to it, the streaming, because I've been very busy. I recently started a course, like an adult education course, and it's after work, and I work, fucking all day long, full time, and then I got to go do that. Then I got to do the podcast, so there's a lot of stuff going on. But until next time, everybody, hope you all do very well in your next week until we speak again. And yeah, I'll see you later. Have a good one, everybody.